Hi, I am Sabina Simonson, Outreach Services and Volunteer Coordinator for the Talbot County Free Library, and you are watching the Talbot County Free Library presents A Long Way Home, Adventures on the Appalachian Trail. Robert Messick, our speaker, is a native of East Maryland, grew up appreciating the outdoors, boating and sailing on the Chesapeake Bay, including crowing on and skippering Chesapeake Bay log canoes. Something very near and dear to my heart. I love them. Which one were you on?
About 8 different.
Oh, wow. After graduating from Santa Clara University Law School, California, Robert was appointed as a trial attorney with the Tax Division of the U.S. Department of Justice, representing the Internal Revenue Service in complex tax litigation. Uh-oh. Make friends now. Make it fast. Robert then entered private practice in Maryland, assisting clients in tax and estate planning, trust and estate administration, and tax compliance. He has 2 adult children who also enjoy the outdoors and backpacking trips. How couldn't they? I don't think they have a choice, just between you and me. He lives in St. Michael's with his partner Lydia, and Linda. Linda might be a little jealous. There is no Lydia. Robert and Linda both teach yoga and Ayurveda, and having received advanced training in both subjects. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm hometown welcome to Robert Messick.
Thank you, Steve. That's quite an introduction. I think you need a round of applause. Well, we're quite fortunate to have Sabina here at the library to support this wonderful program that's on a monthly basis. Is that what you got? Yeah, that's great. So we're here tonight to discuss my experiences on the Appalachian Trail this year. And I'm going to try to condense a 6-month experience into about a 45-minute presentation. So there's a lot to cover. And I want to just get you focused. First, by discussing a little bit about the details of the trail itself. Can everybody hear my voice okay in the back? No problems with the volume? Okay, very good. So the Appalachian Trail, if you don't know, quite long. It covers 2,190 miles over 14 states. So if you were to count, perhaps 5 million steps to do so and covering that distance. The highest elevation is Clingman's Dome, and that's in the Great Smokies National Park. Second highest is Mount Washington in the White Mountains. It takes an average about 5 to 7 months to cover that distance, and the completion rate is rather low, actually. Historically, about 10 to 15% of hikers actually finish the through hike of the entire trail. The rate's gone up a little bit, maybe to about 25% in more recent years. So for me, in preparing for the through hike, I tried to focus on several different areas, making sure I had the proper gear, and I studied a lot of books that people had written about their experiences, try to gain knowledge from them, and then also took a good bit of time in preparing the food and supplies, packaging that for the trip. Then also physical training needed to prepare for the trip. And then lastly, a little bit of mental training as well, because it's not just physical demands that you have out on the trail. It takes a lot of mental stamina, you might say, to be able to stick with it for 5 or 6 months. So to begin with the food preparation, I did all of my own food cooking. This happens to be scrambled eggs and polenta and in the dehydrator, and then it was packaged in vacuum sealed bags so that it could be taken on the trail. Of course, I had my help, my partner Linda in the foreground, and my younger sister Kirky Messick Did a great bang-up job of preparing and packaging all the food for me. And then also my sister, Hope. Some of you recognize her there. I don't have a photo of my mother. She actually was in there packaging food for me as well. So, and then also Julie Lowe, who's the executive director of the Talbot Interfaith Shelter. Anybody else I could find to help, because it was a massive endeavor. So I've had it asked me a number of times, why would I even consider hiking the Appalachian Trail? And I have to say the simple response is that my partner Linda drove me down to Georgia. She kicked me out of the car and said, walk home. Well, it wasn't quite that way. I actually got on an airplane, flew down to Atlanta, Georgia, and then took a commuter train up close to Springer Mountain, which is the southern terminus of the trail. And this is a photo of the first day on the trail at April 15th of this year. I met other people along the trail on that first day, and the four of us, we continued to hike together for about 3 weeks. The youngest one in the group was a 29-year-old. He was a hot shot. Sorry about the microphone, it seems to come and go. The youngest 29-year-old hotshot forest firefighter who served out in some pretty treacherous territories in Alaska, South Dakota, and Nevada. And I figured that if anybody could complete the through hike, it would be this fella, because he was accustomed to carrying a 65-pound backpack with all of his forest fire fighting equipment. It turned out, though, he was the first one in the group to actually leave the trail. He said it was a little bit too much like work, having to hike. So this is a plaque commemorating the southern end of the trail in Georgia. Thank you. And some are curious about my accommodations, and this is my tarp covering over my hammock that I would sleep in at night. So the darker spot in the middle area, let's see, just moving this mouse pointer around, that's the hammock in the center there. Below it is my backpack. Over here is my kitchen sink. That light green colored material. It's a silk nylon 2-gallon container. And I didn't want to give up on hygiene on the trail, so I tried to continue to wash clothing in the evening. You can see it hanging in the background on the clothesline. And then also sponge bath just to try to keep as clean as I could. I would say many of the hikers, they tend to forego the cleaning exercises, but it's not really that well appreciated when they walk into town. So this was the first morning getting up after camping there, and it was a nice surprise to see the beautiful countryside. I should mention the night before, the first night at Hawk Mountain Shelter, there was another hiker that came in for the night, and he was talking about his pack was so heavy, and he left the hotel. He had to use a bellhop's cart to load it and roll it down to the car that he'd take it to the trailhead. And I couldn't believe the story. He said it was 72 pounds. And nowadays, most hikers, they try to keep it in the low 30s if possible. And when he went out to the trailhead, park ranger saw him struggling with it and offered to go through the pack and figure out what he could maybe do with that. So the pack ranger, he pulled out 2 machetes, 3 knives, a 10-pound bag of marbles so he could shoot squirrels with a slingshot, and he had a 10-pound cowboy duster. It's a real heavy canvas, wax-coated kind of jacket that goes full length. He said he'd like to wear horseback riding, but I don't know where he figured that was going to go in with the hiking. And he had a tent and a hammock, and it goes on. It was just really absurd. I couldn't even believe he was telling the truth. It just seemed like he was pulling my leg, but a young lady confirmed that it was actually true. So I only mention him because I ran into other people, similar circumstances, like carrying a big foot-long knife on their chest. I can only think it would be used for maybe skinning a bear. My knife that I carry is about 2.5 or 3 inches long. It's like a miniature Swiss Army knife, and it has a lot more functions. But it sort of illustrates how some people approach backpacking and hiking on the Appalachian Trail. They have notions. This fellow, I think he must have read Tom Sawyer's story and thought that was going to give him guidance on getting down the trail. But some of the others that I met hiking in sandals, which is pretty bizarre. Now there are some experienced hikers that do hike in sandals and they're successful at it, but these were people that had no prior experience and it was not a formula for success. So for those who aren't too successful, within 3 days they reach a place called Neal's Gap. And this is a tree. I don't know if you can really see it that well, but there are all these hikers' shoes and boots dangling from the branches there. And about 25% of hikers, they drop out after 3 days. And the main reason is they find that it really wasn't quite what they were expecting. So their notion of what it is a through hike is quite dismayed. And so that accounts for the first 25%. And then there are other things that can discourage them too. It wouldn't take too long for me to run into some rattlesnakes along the way. And then rain is another deterrent. I show this slide because I was drenched in rain and all my possessions, so I had to find a sunny spot and I put everything out to dry out. It was on an overlook, and before I knew it, a big busload of tourists arrived. And I was sitting down on that stone and cooking a meal. And I really felt like a homeless person in that situation. All my worldly possessions spread out like that in front of all these tourists. But it is beautiful countryside when you can see it. The thing about the Appalachian Trail, it's known as the Green Tunnel. And for much of it, you're just walking under the canopy of the forest, or even tunneling through rhododendron groves. And you'll see that later in a photograph. So it's unusual to have the opportunity to have a nice look to see some of the more distant scenery. This is a photo of Fontana Lake at the southern end of the Great Smoky Mountains. Once I entered the Smoky Mountains, I had my first encounter with bears, and there were 2 cubs. They were up a tall tree. They were up about 70 feet or so, but the mother bear was at the base of the tree, right next to the trail. And there was no way that we were going to get by, we thought. But the day was getting late, and needing to get to our campsites, trying to figure out how we're going to deal with this, we thought, well, maybe if we raise a lot of noise and wave our trekking poles, it'll scare away the bears. Actually, to the contrary, it scared us away because the mother bear reared up in an offensive posture, and I knew it was time to back off. Some others, they saw it as an opportunity to take photographs. I couldn't believe it. I was trying to push them aside. I was getting back out of the way. But we ended up having to sit it out for a couple of hours, so we had essentially a roadblock on the trail because of the bears. Mentioning Fontana Dam, when I was coming down into that area, it's pretty steep, and they've been raining for 3 days straight, And with so much foot traffic from other hikers, it was very sloppy. I took a spill and I went into Gatlinburg to ice my knees that had been injured from the fall. So that ended up being a bit of a problem that didn't go away too quickly. The icing certainly helped, but eventually I decided to go up to Damascus to Linda's sister's property and stayed there for about a week and nursing my knees to try to make it better. And that was a photo from the backyard. While I was doing so, one of the other members of the group I mentioned first starting out with was German. And I thought him as a German hiking machine because he would hike well over 20 miles a day, almost from the get-go. But he was out ahead of me, and this was at McAfee Knob. He took a photo of himself. And unfortunately, he ended up dropping out too because he just pushed so hard, he ended up burning out by Waynesboro, Virginia. Plus, I think he also missed his girlfriend back in Germany. Other snakes encountered. This is eastern greenback, I believe is the name, a rattlesnake. And they were pretty common, especially in Virginia. This is fairly typical scenery along the way. This is, perhaps you've never seen the upper James River that flows down into the Chesapeake Bay. This is quite a bit further upriver. Getting into Shenandoah National Park, this happened to be an evening when there were clouds rolling in, covering a lot of the valley below the Shenandoah Valley. Once I made my way up further into Virginia, this was Blackburn Appalachian Trail Center. And down in between the two trees on the horizon is Washington, D.C. And they say that if you have like a telescope or good binoculars, you can actually see the Washington Monument from this place. But that, I kind of thought it depicted trouble brewing over Washington, D.C. This was a real peculiarity. You never know what you're going to run to on the trail. In northern Virginia, well, it wasn't quite northern, it was a bit north of Front Royal. This fellow was out just day hiking, and it was already close to 90 degrees, nearly 90% humidity. He was wearing this outfit, and I was so curious I had to stop and find out what he was doing. And he was wearing reproduction World War II Japanese combat uniform. I'm sure he had to spend a bit of money for it. I didn't ask how much, but a lot of it's wool, like those leggings are wool. It looked very uncomfortable and hot, and it's heavy too because a lot of it's canvas and leather. But he was also eating Japanese food. He had these little Japanese cakes with it. He was going quite a bit of effort to reproduce it all. So once I got to Harper's Ferry, this is a nice scene, what's called Maryland Heights. So if you're sitting in Harper's Ferry, especially like at the pub, you can look across Potomac River and enjoy that view. While I was in Harper's Ferry, I had a visit from Jack Harold, who's a former president of Talbot Interfaith Shelter, and Julie Lowe, who is still the executive director. And they were coming to give me some more moral support to keep moving along in the efforts for the Talbot Interfaith Shelter. But also while I'm there, this photo is taken in front of the Appalachian Trail Conservancy. That's the administrative body that maintains the trail, organizes all the volunteer members from the trail clubs to make sure that the trail is passable. We wouldn't be able to hike the trail if we didn't have all those volunteers doing what they do. And while I was there, I asked the staff I had in mind, because it was now getting up into the 90s and high humidity, and a lot of the hikers, as they were going up the mountains, they looked like drenched racehorses, just sweating so. And I felt the same. So I thought I wanted to do what's called a flip-flop, where the hiker would go north to Maine from Harper's Ferry and then hike back south to Harper's Ferry to complete the hike. They said that there had been such a heavy snow during the winter in Maine, there was still a lot of melt up there, and the black flies were still quite a nuisance. I'm talking about a second hatching. So they said, well, why don't you go to Vermont or northern New Hampshire or northern Massachusetts and hike north from there. So that's what I decided to do. So I jumped ahead to Bennington, Vermont, and my son Rob joined me. And can you stand up, Rob? So we had a great time, at least I did. I did. Hiked all the way to Hanover, New Hampshire. That's where Dartmouth College is. And saw really beautiful countryside, and it was much cooler there. It was a lot more pleasant. So I was back to really enjoying the hiking, which was my goal all along, was just to enjoy it. And of course, the terrain changed too in Vermont. Beautiful mountains and lakes. And much higher, well, no, not higher elevation, but steeper, I would say, than some of the southern mountains. So when I go through these slides on the views of mountains, it reminds me of a trip I took with my younger sister, Kirky, and my oldest sister, Hope. Hope was living in Denver, and we flew out. I was 13, and Kirky was 11, I think. And we started traveling around throughout the West and enjoying the scenery. And Hope asked Kirky, are you enjoying the mountains? And Kirky said, well, once you've seen one mountain, you've seen them all. So I hope there's no one has the sentiments of that. If so, just please bear with me as we view more mountains, because basically the Appalachian Trail goes all along the mountain ridges, and if there's a high elevation available to send a hiker to, that's where the trail goes. And in fact, the elevation changes so much over time that it's the equivalent of ascending and descending Mount Everest 16 times. So it's over 400,000 feet of cumulative climbing and descending. And that makes the Appalachian Trail more difficult than the Pacific Crest Trail, called the PCT. PCT was built for horse travel, so it's not nearly as steep as the AT. And we'll see some photos that show that. So let's see, we're now in New Hampshire, getting into the White Mountains. The weather tended to be a little bit cloudy, as you can see. And the rocks are so slippery when they're wet and dangerous that I would sometimes sit out and wait for the weather to clear before attempting to hike over some really treacherous terrain of the rocks. This is an area, I believe this is Franconia Ridge. Let's see, yeah, let me back up. It goes up along that sharp edge and continues along the way. But it's a fantastic view. That pile of rocks on the left is called a cairn, and when you are up above the tree line, there are no trees to put up the white blazes that signify the trail, so the cairns serve that purpose instead, so the hikers can kind of figure out where the trail is. There were many places on the White Mountains where were just huge boulder fields. And there were cairns indicating the trail, but it didn't look any different hardly wherever you looked. It's just, you might as well go whatever looked most convenient or safest. So you can see the trail going along the edge there in the foreground. And another perspective on the trail. So the White Mountains very often above the tree line, and that also makes it a lot more dangerous for hikers because the weather is notoriously fickle in that area. And we'll get to Mount Washington, you've probably heard of, where it's especially so. This shows the trail. It's just like a boulders of all sizes, cobblestones, and bigger. But that makes it more difficult where you have to go slower picking your way through it. Normally, on most of the trails, I could average about 2.5 miles an hour, taking into account breaks. But in the White Mountains, most hikers, it takes, they can't do more than about 1 mile an hour. So you have to really plan more thoroughly getting through that area.
What month was that?
This was in July. So along the way through the White Mountains, there are huts where hikers can stay, and they're mainly catered to like day hikers, and they have facilities like bunk beds for the people to stay in. But they also accommodate some of the thru hikers. I probably haven't told you exactly what a thru hiker is, but a thru hiker is considered to be a hiker that goes from one end to the other, or any variation of that, hiking the entire trail. So that's 2,190 miles for the Appalachian Trail. So with the huts in the White Mountains that are maintained by the Appalachian Mountain Club, they offer what's called work for stay. So in my case, I was able to wash dishes in exchange for the privilege of sleeping on the floor in their dining room, which wasn't so bad. Not wanting to be out in the potentially treacherous weather in the evening. So I didn't mind, and occasionally the food was warm, so that was good too. And it wasn't always hard work either, because a couple times I had the job of just speaking about my experiences on the trail, so that was good. I think this is Pinkham Notch in the White Mountains. And this is a sign that you would see climbing up to White Mountain, Mount Washington. Yeah, I'll read it in case you can't see it in the back. The area ahead has the worst weather in America. Many have died there from exposure, even in the summer. Turn back now if the weather is bad. Well, it's true. Since about the mid-1800s, over 150 people have died on Mount Washington. Most often from exposure, but it could be from severe falls. And the week before I climbed Mount Washington, there was a couple that died of hypothermia. So it happens regularly. And I took it seriously, so the day that I wanted to go over Mount Washington, it was pretty nasty weather. And I stayed at a hut that was only about 1.5 miles from the summit, waiting for the following day when it was forecast to be a lot better. But I also wanted to be able to see it, because in bad weather, it's just covered. Now, this is what it looked like when I got to the top of Mount Washington, because I was hiking in fog visibility about 100 feet or so, and it was blowing about 40 miles an hour. It was about 40 degrees, so that was a wind chill, I think, around 34 degrees. But fortunately, the forecast did pan out, not that time. There's a little museum in the observatory, if you've ever been there before, that may look familiar. This is actually, I took a photograph of a photo from a winter scene on Mount Washington. I'd say winter scene, it could be any time of the year, I suppose, because they have snow every month of the year on Mount Washington. And until recently, they had the highest recorded wind speed in the world of 240 some miles an hour. It was only very recently, I think there was a tsunami in Asia that exceeded it, but it's still pretty bad. So this is at the top of Mount Washington, and the weather's beginning to clear. Some of the clouds are parting ways, and you can see the cairns in the foreground marking the trail, and it just winds its way down the mountain. If you've been there before, you've probably seen this clock train, was kind of an amusing looking thing, and it carries the tourists up to the top. Another option is actually driving the car. You've probably seen bumper stickers that say, "My car has climbed Mount Washington." I'm trying to think of an appropriately worded sticker for a hiker, what they can say about climbing Mount Washington. This is a scene from further away from Mount Washington going down, looking back at the observatory on the top and the weather towers. So you can see it's pretty steep in areas. The steepness is a little bit more appreciated here, going down to a hut. It's about the center of the photograph. And the hikers in front of me, I was following, just making our way down to the bottom. That was a day I put in like about 25 miles. So I was trying to get some distance in. There's a lake down in the middle of that photo. It was a beautiful hut that I stayed at as well. Once I got through the White Mountains, I came to Mahoosic Notch, and that's in the southern part of Maine, and it's down, well, a notch is another phrase used in New England for a gap. Gaps used more in the South. In this case, it was more what I think of as a very deep ravine that was completely full of these huge boulders, like 2 or 3 times the size of refrigerators. And they're just strewn all over the place. And this photo is showing a hiker going under some boulders to try to get through all that mess. And it's said it's the single worst, or the most difficult mile of the entire trail. And again, knowing that, I waited out some pretty nasty weather for the following day when it was forecast to be fairly good. And it did dry out, so I didn't have to deal with very wet rocks. The day before, while I was waiting, hikers were coming south, and it was taking them 3.5 hours to get through, whereas I, waiting for better weather, I was able to get through it in about an hour and a half. This is kind of interesting, where you have arrows pointing, directing the hikers where to go. It's hard to figure out otherwise. You have to crawl under rocks, and in this case, I had to take my pack off because it wasn't big enough space for me to get through with my pack on. So I crawled through, and then I reached back for the pack and dragged the pack through. And I had to do that on 3 separate occasions in Mahoosic Notch. And then Maine has many, many lakes and many beautiful lakes. So running across those, this is further along in Maine, where we get up on what are called balds, up on the top of mountains where it's just open rock, not much vegetation at all, some lichens growing on it. And there's a white blaze about the middle of the photograph to help indicate it's painted on a rock. More lakes, and I would say New Hampshire and Maine are probably the more favorite states among hikers. And this particular one has a panoramic view panning around so that you can get a better appreciation for the geography there. Just a single shot doesn't really capture it all. Even this doesn't quite capture it, just how expansive it is. I think that was taken from Saddleback Mountain in Maine. That was where I was on top of Saddleback Mountain. Then once got about halfway or so up through Maine, came to Kennebec River. Maine has so many rivers, quite often you have to ford the rivers by just walking through. Some people try it barefoot, but it's much safer to wear boots so you have traction because the rocks are very slippery from all the slime on the rocks. Tragic story here for Kennebec River. There was a hiker that drowned trying to ford the river about 4 or 5 years ago, so the Appalachian Trail Conservancy made arrangements for a canoe to always be there with a person to get passage for the hikers across the river. So I had to wait, but it was worth the convenience, and so I was seated in the front, and then the main canoe was in the back, and two of us could go across at the time. More lakes in Maine. So once I got to Munson, Maine, I was at Shaw's Hostel, and that's the place where if you're going northbound, you're preparing to enter the 100-mile wilderness. So they have a tradition of always giving you a very hearty breakfast before you hit the road or the trail. And I had already finished my breakfast, and then I think he was just using up his batter, and he creatively made a pancake cairn out of his blueberry pancakes. It was pretty cute. So this is the sign that warns hikers when they're entering the 100-mile wilderness that they need to have at least a day's worth of food to get through the 100 miles. Well, that's assuming that you're going to, say, hike 10 miles a day to get through the wilderness. I was hiking with a French Canadian. He was probably about 15 years younger than me. He was pretty fit, and he was figuring on doing it in about 5 days. I said, okay, let's give it a try. And we did it, 5.5 days. And in order to make it a little bit easier, instead of carrying food for all those days, we just carried enough, I think it was 3 days or 4 days, and then we arranged for a bucket to be dropped about halfway through the 100-mile wilderness for the remaining food we need to get through there. The problem was the bucket wasn't there when we got there. And strange thing is that they call it the wilderness, but I had tried to contact the guy that was going to deliver, and there I'm getting ready to get to sleep in my my campsite. I had a tarp at that point. I got rid of my hammock to try to be lighter, and all of a sudden I get a phone call there in the wilderness. It's the guy trying to reach me at the bucket. And the other thing about the wilderness, I would notice occasionally trucks would be going by on logging roads with canoes or kayaks and whatnot strapped on top. So to me, it didn't really have quite the feel of the wilderness like I'd experienced with my son Rob, where we would go out Dolly Sodd's wilderness out in West Virginia, where no mechanized vehicles are allowed at all. This was a little bit different. So it's a little bit of a hype as far as to say it's wilderness. So once we were a bit into the wilderness, came to a lake where we could actually get a boat ride over to hunting camp. And we elected to do that because they were serving hot food. So this is my hiking partner, the French Canadian, Patrick Auger, and the proprietor at the motor for the camp. And I took the opportunity to clean clothes, as I frequently do, and using a wash tub and washboard with water pumped out of the lake. And being in the wilderness, we had a hot meal with a bottle of wine and no shortage of some accommodations. The proprietor, he said this was a full set that he'd found in the woods, and he brought it back, and it seemed to fit. And have a nice view from the cabin where I was staying. So I was a little surprised in Maine. There are big mountains. Times I've been to Maine before, I guess just going up the interstate, it always seemed kind of flat. But in the southern part of Maine, in particular, there are mountains, and it is pretty steep. It's tough going. But eventually I made it to Baxter State Park, where Mount Katahdin is, and that's the northern terminus of the trail. This was the night before summiting Mount Katahdin with the other hikers. We had pretty much been in tandem, since southern Maine, I think, roughly all hiking about the same pace. So it was kind of nice to be able to finish that way. Now, all the other hikers were completing their through hike. They'd gone from Springer Mountain all the way through to Katahdin. For me, it was kind of bittersweet because I was experiencing what they were experiencing in a sense, but I knew after I did that I was going to have to go back to Bennington and hike south, so I still had a lot more to do. But it was good to have that experience as well. So this is on the way up Mount Katahdin. You see the white blaze, that's the white 2x6 inch paint towards the bottom of the photo. My experience Mount Katahdin, I was a little bit unnerved. I have a fear of heights. And places like that where you'd have sheer drop-offs and you just had to kind of cling to rocks without any grip per se and hoist your body up, trying to get up and around. So it was a challenge. So once I got up there, I was celebrating. The typical pose the thru hikers would take on the sign at Mount Katahdin. But then, how do you get down? And there are a number of trails that go up and down Mount Katahdin. I went up what's called Hunter Trail, and it's very steep. It's easier going up than going down, so a lot of people, they find another way to go down, and that usually is A-ball trails, I mean, that people will choose. Another one that really is beyond my conception, I would say, is this trail that goes out along this ridge here. That's called the Knight's Edge. And I have not been on it yet. But people describe it as being maybe about 3 feet wide at the ridge line of the trail you're walking on. And they say, well, if you fall, you're not going to fall more than a couple hundred feet. No big deal. Well, I don't know. But it's not just that. You get out to what's called chimney. You got to go up that and down, and that's pretty long distance. It looks small from where the photo's taken, but it's very steep going down into there. Another time. But I wanted to also, we've seen a lot of scenery. I wanted to show photos of what the trail itself actually looks like. And this is back in Georgia. So you see a lot of rocks strewn around, and you have to just pick your way through it. Let's see. This will just cycle through different scenes of the trail. This was after a forest fire year before in rhododendron groves. This is showing erosion of the trail. This was after an 80-mile-an-hour windstorm I went through. Moving further north into Virginia, that's the Guillotine, a rock that's wedged between other rocks. And that's in Shenandoah, has a rock scree. That's my son in Vermont. Looks like a walk in the park. The one before, let me back it up a little bit. So I wanted to show you the trail scene where it shows yeah. There we go. Well, that was in New Hampshire. They don't often give you much help getting up the mountains, but this was one case where they did. So they took timbers, chiseled out the stone, and mounted these blocks of wood timbers into the rock side. So it made steps. So that was a bit of a convenience, very nice. New Hampshire. That's looking way down, so it's hard to get a sense of the depth of that going down. And that's looking up. Another place you got to climb up, hoist your body up. In Maine, where there are a lot of wet areas, they have bogs, they have planks. So you're walking like a boardwalk. This is back in New York. Sometimes you're walking on the roads, passing under interstates. This is New Jersey. Boardwalks. This is Pennsylvania, otherwise known as Rocksylvania. Farmland through Pennsylvania. The trail goes through farms and pastures. And other parts of Pennsylvania going through rhododendron groves. So there's quite a variety to the trail as to the terrain throughout the states. So after I'd finished in Maine at Mount Katahdin, I had to return back to Bennington. But first I went home. My mother had a big birthday to celebrate, so that was great fun. And some time with family. Then I flew back to Vermont so I could hike south. So this is getting into Massachusetts, I believe. Stayed at a place called the Upper Goose Pond Cabin. Beautiful spot. And I wanted to show you just an example of a trail register. This is where hikers will sign in or sign out when they're leaving at the different shelters or hostels. And a lot of them just take the liberty of doing some artwork. Some of it's pretty humorous. All kinds of strange things. And all the hikers eventually acquire a trail name. And the trail name usually arises from some event in their life or some characteristic or personality. Mine was easy. My trail name was Long Walk, using it in reference to the Long Walk Home fundraiser. But a more unique trail name I came across, a fellow named Joyride. It turned out that he was trying to hitchhike into town, which is not uncommon for hikers trying to get into town to buy food to resupply. And this other guy picked him up to give him a ride. And they were going along, and before you know it, there were police cars behind with sirens flashing. And the guy who's driving decides to try to outchase the police. So that goes on for a while, but eventually the police catch up and they pull the guy over, and they handcuff both the driver and the hiker and throw them in jail. Turns out the driver was a fugitive from justice. And it took the hiker more than a day to convince the police that he was just through hiking and hitchhiking, but he eventually was released and he acquired the trail name Joyride. This is in Massachusetts as well. This is getting down into Connecticut, the Housatonic River. It's a really pretty river further north. And see, I think General Electric polluted it with PCBs. And they're still fighting it, not accepting responsibility. Eventually getting into New York, this is the Hudson River. And this is looking from a vantage point called Anthony's Nose. I'm not sure what the story is about that. And this is out on Anthony's Nose, that ledge, looking across the river towards Bear Mountain, and the bridge below is called Bear Mountain Bridge. And I wanted to give you another panoramic view because it's a spectacular spot. If you're ever looking for a place to hike, put it on your list. So just swinging around from north towards the south or southeast. Yeah, the train must have been at least half a mile long. I don't have the sound, but you could hear the train in the distance with its so that was a fun day for me, hiking in New York, because of just seeing that scenery. My family, years ago, we had taken our boat trip going up the Hudson River on the way to Canada. So it was fun to go back and see some of that again. But after I walked across the bridge, I went through a zoo. The trail actually goes through the zoo, and it goes past cages with bears. I got to see a few more bears. I ran into a bear on the trail in New York, much further north. Fortunately, it was not habituated, meaning it hadn't been trained to seek out food from humans. So when I took my hiking poles and flashed them, it scared it away and it ran off further into the woods, which I was happy to have happen. This is getting down in New Jersey, and this was a really pleasant surprise for me. New Jersey, my experience in the past was pretty much limited to the turnpike. And to get over into northwestern New Jersey, some very pretty countryside. And some of it is mountainous, and this is one of the views. This was along a lake. Some hikers, I guess, playing fun with rocks, making different cairn statues. So then I got to the Delaware Water Gap, which is where the Delaware River runs between New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Another beautiful spot. And eventually I got to the Susquehanna River, the upper Susquehanna River. This is looking at it from the bridge that leads into Duncannon. And this was the following morning when I got up higher in the mountain, looking down to Duncannon, over the Susquehanna River, where it's covered in a cloud bank. And further along the Kittatinny Ridge in Pennsylvania. Just to zip through a few slides on the vegetation. Some people have an interest in that. Rhododendron. Plenty of places were, especially in the south, to see rhododendron. I don't know all of these, but yeah, columbine. That was Virginia. I was up New Hampshire, vegetation on a pond. Lichens growing up in the bulbs. That was in New Jersey, in the swamp areas, and down in Pennsylvania. Just a few of the shelters or hostels I stayed in. Most shelters are just three-walled buildings and exposed to the elements. So there's not a whole lot to it. Some interesting ones like These hostels in the lower left are log cabins. A lot of the shelters in the south that were built by the CCC using chestnut logs. But even though we had all that beautiful scenery to enjoy, for me the highlight was meeting all the people along the trail. The hikers, people that were in the trail towns. It was really amazing. People. The list on the left shows you some of the countries that the hikers came from that I ran across, and there are many more beyond that I didn't meet that I've known that had come from around the world, probably most of the states in the U.S. as well. And then also what we call trail angels, people that aren't hiking, maybe they were former hikers, but they offer services to hikers, like giving them rides places, giving them food. The photo in the center, that was in the Blue Ridge, young fellows that were just grilling up hamburgers, offering them to hikers as they passed by. Church group on the top, they traveled a couple hours from south of Atlanta, Georgia to offer food to hikers. So it's just amazing what the people do. So I also was amazed by the generosity of people. I would have occasion to talk about what I was doing with the fundraiser, and they would want to be a part of it. So I'm going to turn it back over to Sabina for a minute. You have something you want to say.
Thank you so very much. Thank you, yes. I'm in awe. Wow.